Sean Sullivan, a longtime member here at the Portland Java user group. Tonight we'll talk about Netty. Netty is a networking library and been using it for a couple of years. So tell you some of the war stories that I have of using it in production. All right. So about myself, I've been doing Java for a long time. Mostly work on back-end systems these days. I work for Grubhub and work on a platform engineering team. We support an internal framework that uses Spring Boot. So within Grubhub, there's a microservice architecture, and every team needs to build with Java. So they all use our central framework that we provide. And also at Grubhub, we also have sort of a HTTP router, let's call it, which is built on Netty. It's been running in the company for more than 10 years. So Netty is part of our production environment.
HTTP router, like reverse proxy.
Yeah, sort of a proxy. Yeah. Yeah, it takes HTTP traffic and then redirects it other places. Yep. So I've been contributing to some open source projects recently, including Netty. So the Netty project has accepted some very minor bug fixes from me, but the one I'm most proud of is that I had to fix one of the HTTP compression support for Brotli. Brotli is supported in Google Chrome and Safari and Firefox. And I found a bug in how Brotli was being handled within Netty, so that got merged 2 years ago. Anyway, but within the Netty ecosystem, I mean, Netty is just a library for networking to read and write data to the network. And then there's other open source libraries that are built on top of Netty. So some of these you might already be using, like the async HTTP client is a popular Java library. And then Reactor Netty is also pretty popular for HTTP servers or HTTP clients. So Netty itself is just open source. Anyone can contribute to it, but the primary contributors are actually employees of Apple. Apple funds most of the engineering work that's going on with Netty. And the project itself has a really good release cadence. You'll typically see a new release, a new version of Netty at least once a month. So it's a really vibrant, active, healthy project. So like if you report a bug, they're on it like pretty fast. So previously I worked at Netflix, and this is where I had a lot of exposure to Netty. I was working on the cloud gateway team at Netflix, and at Netflix, that's the box labeled Zool. That is the API gateway. So imagine you're Netflix and you've got a lot of customers with smart TVs and iPhones and iPads. All those devices need to send their network traffic to some central point, and that is the API gateway at Netflix, which is Zool, and Zool is built on top of Netty. So literally every time you're using Netflix and maybe you're browsing like the list of movies in a movie catalog on Netflix, those requests are all being handled by Netty on the server. And then anytime data is being persisted on the back end, Cassandra is one of the primary data stores at Netflix, and Cassandra is also built on the Netty framework. So you're probably using Netty every day indirectly. And so the Zool software is actually open source. You can find it all on GitHub. It's kind of like an interesting case study of how to build new capabilities above and beyond Netty. But fundamentally, if you're on GitHub and you go to the Zool project, you can find one of the main classes is called server.java. Zool is a server, started up, and it listens on port numbers. And so in the Zool server, it's basically just initializing a Netty server bootstrap. And you'll find this pretty much any open source project that's using Netty is going to import the server bootstrap and then configure the bootstrap parameters, and then away you go. You've got a server listening on one or more ports. And so when you're starting up a Netty server, what you typically do is configure what's called a channel pipeline in Netty. And this is straight from the Zool open source project. So in Zool, you want to register things like timeout handlers, because if you're Netflix and you've got hundreds of millions of devices connected, there may be some network timeouts. And so the Zool framework registers timeout handlers, and some other TCP handlers and HTTP handlers, to basically define how the server is going to behave when it's running. And this is a little bit more in-depth look at one of the Zool Netty handlers. This is called close on idle state. So if a connection goes idle, you probably don't want to keep it open, so you might want to shut it down. And that is, close on idle state handler is a Zool class, and it's extending a Netty base class called the channel inbound handler adapter, which maybe we'll talk about later. But nevertheless, at Netflix, the Zool software actually uses a metric to keep count of the number of idle connections that have been closed. Because if you kind of know, if you're working in a big distributed system, you want to have some observability metrics, and you want to know, like, oh, is there a normal amount of idle connections, or is there some abnormal spike in network activity? And so this is straight from the Zool open source code, but it will basically register a handler with Netty, and it's going to react to an event that says, oh, this connection went idle. It's called an idle state event. And so Zool will increment a little counter, and then it will basically close the connection there. So that's fairly typical in a Netty application where you register a handler, and that handler is basically getting a callback of some event that's happening on the network. So, if like some data has arrived, that's an event, or if like you lost the connection, that's an event. And then your handler classes are just sort of reacting to these events, and you can embed your own custom logic for that. And then another thing that Netty can do is WebSockets. And Netflix actually uses WebSockets extensively, and it's all based on Netty WebSockets. There was a presentation about 6 or 7 years ago at AWS reInvent, where one of the Netflix engineers explained how Netflix uses Netty to broadcast messages to smart TVs. So if you think about it, there's probably hundreds of millions of smart TVs in the world. Some of those have a Netflix app on them. And you could imagine Netflix wants to push data to those devices. And so there's a WebSocket connection to most smart TVs. And so on the server side, you've got Netty, which is capable of sending out and broadcasting data over WebSockets. gonna skip through some of this. And then on the back end for data persistence, Cassandra is a popular data store for big companies. At Grubhub, we use Cassandra. That's like our main production database. And Cassandra itself is built on Netty for all the I/O, the network I/O. And this code is from the Apache Cassandra repo. And guess what? It's similar to how Zool was implemented. You import the Netty server bootstrap, and then you instantiate an instance of the server bootstrap. And you configure how you want the server to behave, basically, on startup. So that's very common approach. So Netty is sort of just this building block that lots of modern systems use. But it's just like, low-level library. And typically application programmers are going to be using some sort of framework that's an abstraction on top of Netty. So even though you may not use Netty directly, it may be part of your application class path. And so there's a whole lot of big data projects from the Apache Foundation that are built on Netty. I mentioned Cassandra already, and then ActiveMQ is like pub/sub messaging on the server side. Flink is like stream processing for big data. Apache Pulsar, that's like a messaging system that came out of Yahoo. Apache Zookeeper runs on Netty. I believe the Zookeeper came out of Yahoo as well in the dark ages. But anyway, so Netty is really like a building block for many projects. And then more recently, anyone using Elasticsearch or OpenSearch, either of those. So OpenSearch is a fork of Elasticsearch, but it's built on Netty. So it has a Netty server bootstrap as part of its initialization. And there's many more. I'm going to skip through this, but why is Netty popular? It's basically just a library to do non-blocking I/O. So if you're trying to build like a system at Netflix scale and you want to handle 100 million, users, it's more efficient to build a Java application using a non-blocking I/O approach. And that's really what Netty gives you, is a programming model for doing non-blocking I/O. And if any of you have looked at older versions of Java, you know that there's already networking support baked into the JDK as far back as JDK 1.0. But in the beginning of Java, people would build servers using this class called server socket. And this approach was just really for blocking I/O. And so, in the early days of Java, this was all you had, and there was really not much choice. Everyone was building with a server socket. And then over time, Sun Microsystems and then Oracle made some improvements to the JDK, and they built this other replacement, the server socket channel, which is a non-blocking I/O capability in the JDK. But Netty aspires to go beyond what's in the JDK. And so, as a Java developer, if you're planning to read and write from sockets in your server, you really do have three choices. I mean, you could use a Java server socket, which is the classic way. You could use the server socket channels, which is called NIO, or you can use Netty. And those are kind of like the three like mainstream options that people build with today. But Netty is sort of like a bit more advanced than what's in the JDK, so it gives you more capabilities. So the core concept in Netty is this thing called a channel. And you can think of a channel as just a Java object, and that you can read data from a channel or write data to a channel. So it's like a Java socket in a sense. So you're reading and writing this data to channels. And then within a Netty application, you configure a channel pipeline. So you're defining how you want to process the data that's arriving on your channel, or how you want to write data to a channel. You configure a pipeline of operations that you want to happen for either reading or writing. And then you have sort of within a channel pipeline, what you're registering are these objects called channel handlers. And we saw one earlier. The earlier example was close on idle state. That was essentially a handler to respond to network I/O events. The other thing Netty gives you is a way to manage data. It's called a byte buff. And this is sort of a hyper optimized way of allocating data and deallocating data. And if you're building a server that wants to scale to, tens of millions of users and connections, it's really important to have these optimized data structures. So this byte buff class is sort of a replacement for the JDK byte buffer. So when you're in the Netty ecosystem, you'll be using byte buffs. And so you're probably wondering, like, why do byte buffs exist? It's just a way to efficiently allocate memory and deallocate it. And the Netty team came up with the idea that that these objects should be reference counted. And it's kind of like a way to maximize the performance of your server. And so you use these byte buffs, which are pooled objects. And one of the goals of having a pool of these buffers is that it reduces the amount of garbage collection that's happening in the JVM. So if you're trying to scale to, tens of millions of users, it's important that you could reduce the garbage collection activity. And that's one of the explicit goals of Netty 4, is to minimize garbage collection. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's actually allocating memory off heap. So Netty uses JNI to interface with some native code. So the Netty library is Java classes and native code, and it's all bundled into like jar files. But basically, Netty is allocating memory, off heap, and so it requires you as a developer to think about memory a bit more than you typically would in a classic Java application. And so, Netty itself has a lot of native code that you typically would add to your class path. So they package it up as jar files, and then you add those jars onto your class path. And then at runtime, when the server bootstrap is starting up, it is actually loading some native libraries, part of that. So like this is a pull request I submitted last year to this Graylog server project, but I wanted to be able to run this code really efficiently on ARM 64. ARM processors, and so, but they were missing one of the jar files. Um, they were missing the ARM64 jar. So anyway, this got merged, but basically, there's other things that you would configure in your application. Like here, this is an example of where I'm planning to deploy to Linux, and it's going to be ARM64 on Linux, and I want to take advantage of the Linux epoll, which is the operating system syscall. And so as a Java developer, I needed to like configure my project to include this specific library because I know I'm going to deploy to Linux on ARM64. Maybe I'm deploying to Graviton on EC2. And so as a Java developer, you need to think about getting your libraries set up properly for however you're planning to deploy. But within Netty, there's different what they call transports. The way that Netty is reading and writing data uses this transport metaphor. And most Netty applications will be deployed to Linux. And so the majority of those applications are using what they call the epoll transport. In fact, if you look at the Netflix Zool, epoll is the default transport. So when the server starts up, it tries to initiate the epoll transport. There's other options. IOU ring is kind of a newer alternative on Linux. It's maybe less mature than epoll, but it's emerging as an alternative. And then KQ is sort of for BSD systems or Mac OS. So if you're running Netty on Mac OS, you'd probably have KQ on your class path.
Yeah, so for the native transports, you need to have some libraries that are machine code, like libraries, DLLs, whatever.
Yeah, so it's basically jar files, and the native code is packaged inside the jar files. And when you have those jar files on your class path, Netty can read the class path, and it will attempt to do in Java, there's an API called load library.
Yeah.
And it'll try to do a load library. And if it's on your class path, it'll use it. If it's not, it'll fall back to a less optimized implementation. So configuring your class path is pretty important. These libraries are considered optional in Netty, but in general, if you want a highly optimized server, you want to set up your class path with the right jars. And so on the right-hand side, there's something called TC native boring SSL. Does anyone know what boring SSL is? Boring SSL comes from Google. It's an open source project. It's a fork of Open SSL. Google wanted to have their own SSL implementation where they controlled it because they wanted to have SSL in a browser. So Google Chrome, the reason boring SSL exists is because of the Chrome browser, basically. And then the Netty project saw this library and said, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we put a Java wrapper around boring SSL? And then so the Netty team has this thing called TC native. And if you put it on your class path, it gives you a more optimized implementation of SSL handling. And for most applications, it doesn't matter because a lot of applications aren't going to be like doing SSL decoding. But at Netflix, it did matter because if you look at the Zool code base, it actually registers a SSL handler. And that handler will take advantage of boring SSL if that jar file is present on your class path. And then the other things on the right-hand side, Brotli for J. Brotli is a compression system for HTTP content. Um, and Brotli for J is like this third-party library um, that integrates with Netty. So if Netty sees that you've put Brotli for J on your class path, then Netty will be able to do Brotli compression for you. And then Z standard is a Java library. Z standard is a compression algorithm that came out of Facebook. And more recently, browsers, very modern browsers are now supporting Z standard compression. So I think Google Chrome in the last year started supporting Z standard for web responses. So you may be, if you're running Chrome on your laptop, you may be getting Z standard content from some servers today. And so Netty can actually now encode things into Z standard or Brotli and return those responses to client devices. And I'm going to skip through IOU ring because these slides are outdated. But I will say that so Netty lets you explicitly configure certain socket properties. And this is actually the default behavior in the Netty code itself. There's a property called TCP no delay, and by default it is set to true. And I never gave much thought to this because it seems like a low level detail. And I just assumed, oh, Netty will do the right thing. And, in fact, this is how it initializes things. And then last summer, I read this blog post. This is from a guy at AWS. He wrote an entire blog post about this particular setting. And he's like, yeah, make sure you set it correctly. That's the purpose of this blog post. And he basically said that at AWS, whenever he's like investigating a networking issue, he looks to see if no delay is set or not. Anyway, so it turns out Netty will actually just do this by default for you. So you don't necessarily have to think about this. But anyway, this blog post is sort of fascinating in and of itself. Anyway, it turns out at Netflix in the Zool gateway, there was actually a bug. I forget what year this was. This was within the last 2 years. But some of these socket options were not being initialized properly in the Zool gateway. And so this is a pull request that got merged to address that. But the Zool code base actually explicitly, so this is that server bootstrap thing that we've been talking about. So as part of initializing the server, you can set up different socket options. And this is how the Zool server initializes the channel options, I guess, is maybe the right vocabulary. But anyway, so to like really hyper optimize a gateway server, you can explicitly set different properties that you want on your channels. And then Zool and Netty both can do content compression. And Netty itself already gives you 4 different flavors of compression. gzip is the most common for web content, but like Brotli and Z standard are the more modern varieties. And so if you want to have compressed HTTP responses with Netty, you have to explicitly configure a channel pipeline, and you have to initialize, it's called a content compressor. And then you can configure different options for your content compression. You can configure which algorithms you want, or you can just have Netty discover what's on your class path and then make some choice based on what it finds on your class path. But so when I was at Netflix, I actually wrote an integration test, and you can see this is actually code that's out on GitHub. But there's actually an integration test that does an HTTP client get, says HTTP get, sends it to the Zool server, and Zool will respond with a gzip compressed response. And then this test will verify that it can decode the response body, basically. And then there was a test case for Brotli as well. But anyway, as far as Netty programming, there's a whole lot of pitfalls that I encountered the last couple of years. The most egregious thing is that there's two different cookie classes in the Netty API. One of them is deprecated, and then the one below is the replacement for the deprecated one. But it's very easy to make this mistake because it just, depending on how if your IDE is importing one versus the other. I mean, most people don't check the imports. They'll just let their IDE import whatever it wants. Or maybe you're using an AI tool that is picking the wrong one. But it turned out at Netflix, the Zool gateway was using the wrong cookie implementation for quite a number of years. And then some smart engineer, not me, found that there was a different cookie class to be used.
Looks like the first one's more correct.
It does look more
If you're like,
correct.
which one of these am I going to choose? I'll just choose this one.
If I was doing a code review, if I was reviewing someone's code and they had that top one, I'd probably just approve it. It looks correct. But yeah, the Java docs explained that it's somehow got some technical flaws to it, so they built a replacement, the Netty team. Yeah.
So maybe they're keeping it, some stuff will break,
Yeah,
they take it out.
yeah.
Yeah.
They're preserving backwards compatibility for people that are still stuck on the old cookie class.
But I was gonna ask later, but since you start mentioning cookie stuff, from an application developer point of view, can you use Netty as a replacement to Tomcat or not? Or
Netty,
does it implement the servlet API?
I mean, Netty does not implement the servlet API. Netty is like a more of a low level networking layer. There's other projects that have better abstractions. So like the React Netty project, React Netty has an HTTP server that's a bit more comparable to what Tomcat does. It's not a replacement for Tomcat, but it's a bit more similar to that abstraction.
Yeah, and the spin side.
Yeah, so it's
That's right. Yeah, Spring Web Flux is an even better abstraction that has Netty underneath it. Yeah. Let's see. This is another pitfall that I encountered. There's different ways of setting up the content compressor. And when I was writing some production code, I used this thing on top. I was like, oh yeah, I'll just instantiate it. It has a 0 arg constructor. That seems really straightforward. Turns out that's actually wrong. Don't use that. What you're supposed to do, so they had to preserve backwards compatibility. And so they preserved the original constructor, but then they were like, oh, we should give you other compression options. And so if you want to explicitly pass in compressor options, you could call this constructor. But you could also just pass in like a null value for compressor options, and then it will do some magic under the hood. And it turns out that's actually the magic is this lower one, and it actually is the right one. But I had written some code that was doing the thing on top, and I was scratching my head as to why compression didn't do what I needed it to do. And this is not really well documented in the Netty docs, but I learned it through trial and error, basically. Let's see what else. This was a horrible pitfall that I encountered like 2 years ago. So you remember when Java 21 was released?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so Java 21 became like a production version. And at Netflix, we tried deploying the Zool gateway to production on Linux using Java 21. And it turned out that Netty on Linux with the epoll transport did not work with Java 21. And basically the JVM process crashed. And so luckily this was only deployed as a canary version at Netflix. It was not like broadly deployed to the whole fleet. But it prevented us initially from rolling out Java 21. And it turns out the Netty team, who many of whom work for Apple, they found the same bug, like literally maybe even the same week or the same day as us. But so the Netty team was working on a fix almost immediately, and they put out a minor version bump like within 4 days of Java 21 coming out. It was like pretty fast. They felt Java 21 compatibility was really important. And then they sent out this tweet. This was September 2023, and they called it an emergency release. And it said Netty could crash the JVM with JDK 21. And they're like, hey, if you're using Java 21, make sure you get the latest version of Netty. And sure enough, this did fix the issue. And basically, under the covers, it was like they were loading native code and it was using JNI, and there was like some things that were sort of different with JDK 21. And so they had to kind of like clean up some of the JNI native code stuff. Anyway, another pitfall that it happens in Netty applications is resource leaks. And you know, in Java, we don't often have this problem because we don't keep a count of objects. In Java, you know, we say you're like, you know, instantiating some Java bean. You're not keeping a count of how many have been instantiated. And you're not releasing those objects either. That's the garbage collector's job, is to keep track of, you know, are these objects in use or not in use? Well, in Netty, it's a little different. Netty actually has a more complicated programming model, and you have to think about reference counts of certain objects. And the reason Netty did this was really for performance. They wanted to manage their own pools of objects. And some of these object pools are off heap. So the Java garbage collector doesn't know that they're there whatsoever. And that means that your application code needs to think about freeing these resources, or decrementing the count is really the metaphor. And so it turns out that in the Netty's documentation, they basically have a warning to developers. They're like, oh yeah, reference counting is useful, but it's like can go really sideways. You could start leaking a bunch of objects, you know, resources basically, and then your server could crash if you start leaking too many resources. And it's really hard to debug resource leaks in Netty. It's sort of counterintuitive because most Java developers aren't going to think about like, oh, why are all my objects hanging around in memory? And why is my process consuming all these resources? And the longer my process is running, the like more resources it's consuming over time. And back in 2017, there was this conference in St. Louis, Strange Loop. And one of the Netflix engineers gave a talk about Netty and Zool. Well, it was really Zool was the topic, but this is one of the slides from 2017. He basically is like, "Oh yeah, we put Zool 2.0 in production, and the servers would slowly use more memory, and then eventually, like the processes would consume so many resources that they would like stop working." And so, the point of the slide was, these were hard issues to debug. And Netty does have like some tools to help you identify these resource leaks. They have this mechanism called leak detector. And it has like 4 different modes. And if you know you have a resource leak, then you might want to like turn on paranoid mode, which will help you see what's going on. But paranoid mode is, they actually say don't use it in production. So like, maybe you could run your server locally on your laptop. And then you could turn on paranoid mode for that process running on your laptop. And then the paranoid leak detector will print out some diagnostic messages and tell you, oh, there's something really horrible going on. And it will help you try to pinpoint what is leaking and where it's leaking. And so in the Netty documentation, they basically say that, if you have a test suite, either unit tests or integration tests, why not just turn on paranoid detection while your test suite is running? So if you're running in Jenkins, say you've got a Jenkins CI server or something like that, you could turn on the paranoid detection while the test suite is going. And that's actually a good approach, because then you could possibly catch some leaks before you go to production.
Sorry, could I interrupt?
Yeah.
Is there like an example of something a developer would do wrong that would cause this? Like, is this like using a bad library, or is this like some?
All right. I'm glad you asked. Let's go to some code here. Okay, let's see. So I've got fix this. Okay. Hopefully that's a giant font, but okay, so this is code that you can find out on GitHub. It's the async HTTP client library. Okay, and this library uses Netty. So what this library does is it can send an HTTP GET, and then this is actually using Netty on the client. So the HTTP GET is routed, basically through Netty, and sends the request over the network. Anyway, so let's say that you had a test suite here, and maybe one of your tests is called the automatic decompression test. And this is like gonna exercise Brawley compression and gzip compression. So what this test does is it, sets up sort of a local HTTP server. That server is going to listen on a port, and then this test is going to start sending HTTP GETs requests to the server. And so what I've done here is I've actually embedded a leak detector onto this class. So this is using JUnit 5. So there's a JUnit 5 extension that will be activated when this test runs. And when the test is executing, it's going to initialize the leak detector in paranoid mode. And so the the paranoid leak detector is going to inspect all of the Netty resources, and it will tell us if anything is wonky. So first, I'll just run this as is. So we'll just run it. We'll just run it in its default state here, but you can see this test is doing three different test cases, 3 kinds of compression, HTTP compression. All right, and the test passed. Okay, cool. So what did that tell me? That means like, okay, there were no leaks actually, because the leak detector did not complain about anything here. But let's say like, let me find this. Look, there's a line of code about reference counting. So this is part of the HTTP client library. And so every time there's some sort of HTTP response from a server, this library will, process the response. And part of processing the response is that, there may be an HTTP response body. That response body might arrive as multiple chunks. Sometimes like a huge HTTP response will arrive as like small chunks. Anyway, so in this library, it can actually deallocate the chunk. You don't necessarily need to keep all the chunks. The raw Netty objects don't always need to be in memory at all times. But so this is actually deallocating or decrementing a reference count of a Netty object here. But let's see what happens. What would happen if comment out that code? So now I'm no longer releasing the reference. This seems rather dangerous. But let me, I'm gonna hit the run button here. Run my test again, and then we can see what happens over here. Well, look at that. So I commented out 1 line of code, and now like, my test has gone sideways. So what's happened here is the paranoid leak detector was tracking the Netty object, the Netty resources, and it discovered that there were some Netty objects that were never deallocated, basically. And so this test suite failed, which is what I was hoping for, because when there's a programming error in the code, I want my test suite to fail. And so let me just scroll through here, but hopefully that's readable, but it actually logged an error message on the console. And the log message came from the leak detector. And the leak detector says, ooh, you have a leak and you had a byte buffer and it was not released. So that means that your application is allocating a bunch of buffers and not freeing them, more or less. So that's what the Netty runtime is telling us. And then in the stack, there's actually a stack trace here, but it's using what's called a leak aware byte buffer, which is some internal thing inside of Netty. But that is basically, if you look at the whole stack trace, you can kind of tell that like, oh, this is the HTTP client had response body that is being processed. And that's kind of where things went sideways. So anyway, so there is a way to catch these problems. And the real solution here was to use this thing called the Netty leak detector extension class. So it's a JUnit 5 extension that I just applied onto my class. And you're probably wondering, oh, where does this leak detector extension come from? Well, it's not really built into It's not built into Netty itself. It's an extra library. I'm just gonna scroll forward here, but it is a library that I wrote, and it's on GitHub. But this is like a year ago. I was like scratching my head. I was like, oh, why isn't there a JUnit extension to do this for me? Because I don't want to have to set this up across many libraries and many projects. Anyway, so you can just add this to your class path, the Netty leak detector JUnit extension, very Googleable. But it's a Java library that you just add to your class path, and then you can enable it from there. But the way it works, there's a thing called a leak listener. The Netty library gives you a way to register a listener for leak events. And this extension will listen for leak events, basically. And if it sees any leak event, then the extension will tell your test suite to fail. So it's deeply integrated with JNet 5, basically. And this is how you would enable it. Version 006. It's a trustworthy version. I just released it last week. I could probably call it 1.0. But yeah, anyway. I'm a little conservative on the versioning, as you can see, 00. But anyway, so it's just one line of code, and that's all you need to make it work. So I contributed I wanted to use the extension in the async HTTP project. So I convinced the owner of the project to accept my enhancement. And then the Reactor Netty library, I tried to do the same thing for them. It's currently in draft status, but eventually I'm gonna get this merged into the Reactor library as well. I'm gonna skip through this, but there's a project called Pinot, and they did not have leak detection enabled. So I submitted this a year ago. This is one of the Apache big data projects. So now they do leak detection in their test suite as well. What else? I'm probably gonna skip through this, but I'll just say that in October 2023, there was like this big, horrible security bug on the internet. It was called Rapid Reset, and Netty was vulnerable to this attack vector. And the Netty team put out a release in October 2023. And Norman is like the technical lead. He works for Apple, and he tweets all the release notes. But this was a really important bug fix for anyone running Netty. You had to get to version 4.1.100. This is really the minimum that you should have in production. If you're running anything older than this, you're kind of in big trouble. You're vulnerable to the rapid reset bug. So it's kind of important to get to this version or higher. And then Spring Boot, I don't know that this really matters, but if you're in the Spring ecosystem, Spring has 4 different ways of doing HTTP responses. Anyway, there's an interface called web server, and then there's 4 implementations of the web server interface. But if you really want Netty on your class path for Spring Boot, you set up the Webflux starter, basically. What's next for Netty? Netty 4.2 is coming out very soon. Kind of cleans up some API cruftiness of older versions of Netty. And then Netty 5, which has been in development for like 5 or 6 years. I don't know what this roadmap is there. But I wouldn't count on it. I'd just say wait for Netty 4.2. Anyway, what else? Skip that. So basically, Netty is everywhere. It's probably on your class path today. if you really want to use Netty to its full capabilities, you could configure your own channel pipeline and your own channel handlers. It's a very extensible framework. And you know, the reason it's widely adopted is just really a rock solid library with monthly releases. You all like almost every monthly release fixes some bugs, and um, it's rare to see a regression in any of the Netty releases. They have a really comprehensive test suite, so it works really well. So we'll just end there, but yeah. Um, yeah, Netty is a good tool. Highly recommended. All right. Actually, I'll bigger the screen here. All right, so can you hear me on the Zoom? Unmute it? No,
Okay.
now I muted here. All right, so today I'm going to talk on Bootify.io, which I will show in a second. And actually, as far as slides, I have one slide. And if you want to copy one thing out of the slide, is this URL. And if you have a laptop, you can open it and you can start playing with the tool, with the paid version of this tool. So I'll leave that there for a while. If you guys want to play, just keep in mind that if you get in, you will write over each other. So I'll show you what you can do. So, well, it's not too many people here, but and also I've put on GitHub some of the code demos that I'll show you how to create. So it's already there if you just want to look at the code that it generates. And let's see. So Bootify.io, it's a closed source tool. It does cost money if you want the paid version. There's a free version that actually is already pretty useful, and I'll show you what it can and what it can't do. But I imagine everybody does codes with Java knows what the Spring initializer is, right? So let's go there. Just a really quick example. So let's say I want to do an application with some web services, REST services, and I want to create a front end with some other tool. So you go to the initializer, and let me see if I can figure out to get back to it. So you pick, let's say, web services, Postgres, going to use that database. You want to do some authentication, and sounds great, right? So you have all your dependencies. Then you can look at what actually you're going to get if I can figure out how to move the browser out. There you go. You look what you get, and yeah, you get a build file. Then you look at the code, and basically this is all the code you get. Then you say, hey, how about some unit testing? Well, that's the unit test you get. So while this is already pretty good for what it does definitely saves you a lot of time. At least in the old days, pre this tool, I used to always have one project that I had all my dependencies in, and then I would update it. Then this came out, I was like, oh, wow, I don't have to do that anymore. Cool. So I've definitely used this a lot, and it's definitely useful, but it really doesn't do much. And so, of course, I've always been trying to find out tools that simplify coding. And one of the alternatives I want to mention that maybe you guys are more familiar with is JHipster. I don't know if you guys ever used it. I did try to use it a little bit, and I found that the code generator always had some little problems here and there, and it would just never really work.
So I kind of gave up on it. On the other hand, I played around a little bit with JMix, which is, I think, way back in the day, the Cuba guys were here, which was a predecessor of JMix. And it's more of a, you have a GUI, you generate a lot of Spring Boot code with a lot of dependencies on their own code, on other libraries. So it's very tied into their thing. This one instead, then I found this Bootify is relatively recent. And so it's basically just like initializer, but I just want to show you what it does because I think it does quite a bit. So, and this is, I have the paid version. There are 3 different versions. I have the intermediate professional one. It's about $100 a year, or you can buy 3 months or something like that for less. And so at the beginning, it looks fairly familiar to, looks kind of like an initializer. So you put your project name, you pick what type of build you want, language, and then this is where it starts getting interesting. Well, you have options like Lombok, which these days seems like it's becoming an ante pattern. I don't know if people still use it or not, but and then you can start picking a front end. So this is where it gets really interesting. And in the, I think in the free version, you only get time leaf and the other options, but with the paid version, you get Angular. And as of yesterday, actually, I've been in contact with the developer of this tool. He said that React support was coming in March. And yesterday I got an email and it says it's out, it's published. And so I've been playing with it and I'll show you what you can do. So yeah, so let's say React with Bootstrap, or if you prefer Tailwind CSS, if you want a different type of UI, then you pick a database. And even here, the choices are pretty good. Usually for demos, I would recommend H2 or something like, embedded, but it does support the other ones. So for this example, I'm gonna stick to Postgres. In my post DB2 days, that's what I've been using mostly. Then again, with the paid version, you get DB generation. Actually, no, in the free version, you only get Hibernate. So it will be based, database generation will be based on JPA. But if you pick Flyaway or Liquibase, and I kind of prefer Flyaway, you'll see you'll get the full SQL. Then, then there's some other stuff. I don't want to go into every detail here, but it does give you a bunch of options. Let's say we want also do a REST with a Swagger UI. And then what's really interesting in the paid version is the Docker support, and you'll see that in a second. Java version 21 and integration test. Yes, that will be interesting. Oh, and then for it lets you do either just entity classes or also DTOs. So I'm going to do DTOs with that library map struct to move the data around. And here, okay, so this was just general setup. Next phase is entities. Does anybody have a SQL database ready to go? No? All right. So it will pull in a full schema from anything in any database, at least of those supported, but then it will generate them to whatever you want. So you can start with Oracle database, and in seconds, you'll see you'll have a database, a schema for something else. If you don't have a schema, then you can start putting an entity. So I don't know, let's call it user group meetings. Primary key, I'm gonna do it really simple here and just name of the group. You can specify other things. So in the first, the examples I already prepared, it's a little bit more interesting, but this is just to give you an idea. Then you have data objects. Oh, yeah, actually, one thing they have to do here is actually say you do want REST endpoints for this entity. And you can also add a front-end controller for it. And since we specified React, we're not going to get MVC controllers, but we're going to get REST controllers. So that's why you have to use REST at least. Then in the paid version, you also get pagination and filtering and search. So I'll save on those. And Okay, so we have the controllers already auto-generated for that. Then, this is exclusive to the paid version, you do Spring Security. So the basic configuration is just nothing really. But then you can start adding very easily. Has anybody used Keycloak or any AAuth? So it's not that simple to set it up. I mean, it is a great tool, but it takes a while. Okay, so you'll like this part. So sec, let's just call it sec. We're gonna specify Keycloak resource server for REST APIs. Realm ID is just an ID that you specify. Then you need to, usually you need to have a user table to back up what you have in Keycloak. In this case, if you just don't specify, it'll just be for simple testing. It will auto-generate some demo data and we don't have to worry about a backing database. If you already meant this to go to production, then you would want to have a user info type of table, and then you have to dig a little bit more in detail what fields you want. And then here it gets interesting. So role, if you're familiar with role user, and guess what happens here? You already have all the different endpoints that you can say for the API for the home. So let's say home and API. As you can see here, they're being added at the bottom for role user. And let's add another one. Admin, there's another typical one. And let's say this one will get, I'm just gonna put, I don't know, Swagger, just give you an example. So you have to have that role. Save it. And okay, we're about to see everything. So check out what it generates. The build file is already a little more in detail, and it also has NPM support. So for the front end, I don't know if anybody has done React, but I'm just starting. So, but you need to have a Node installed and all that. But the build file will already run it for you. But then check out the code. This is where I think it gets really interesting. So instead of yes, it does generate you the run like the initializer does, but let's go check out everything else that it generates. So under config, you configure all the JPA. Jackson for doing all the marshaling, and so it does a little bit of configurations there. React, this is for dealing with some React stuff, and here's the security stuff. So it generated, just based on what I typed, a full-blown Spring Security configuration with all the different paths, JWT, and everything. Also does, I don't know, this I remember when I had to do it in my own application. I had to move to AAuth 2. I had to figure out to do this. Just a lot of little things, but it does it all for you. It configures Swagger since I picked that option. So and this is the only controller that it really puts, because the rest is REST. And here's the domain, which is basically a JPA entity. All done for you. Model. Oh, this, okay, we can skip this one. Generates the repo for you based on JPA. And again, you could have 100 tables, it would do for all of them. So that's, and then you have the REST controllers. Actually, no, sorry, there you go. So just by defining essentially the entity, you have all this done. Then I specified service. I did not specify interfaces, so you get the implementation here. And the mapper, like we're talking, using that map, the mapping. Does that from DTOs to entity beans and vice versa. And then some utility stuff. For example, the user roles are put in a class here, and some other stuff to support the coding. For resources, as you can see, the application YAML, it's a little more complex of what the initializer does. So it sets you up completely for JPA, or database connection, security already configured, figured out, error handling, and all that. And then, since I specified flyaway, here's the database. So if I had entered that Oracle database initially with the import tool, I could generate something immediately in Postgres or whatever other database I picked. And then for testing, this is also, I think is pretty interesting. Well, you have the context loads, but then you have a base integration testing class that does a lot of the setup for you. So this is a pretty good one. And then here's a REST test. Oops. This unit test actually tests every single REST point, and it created JSON. Well, in this case, it's pretty simple, but it already created JSON requests to test against the data. Oh, and then to set up Keycloak, because you will see in a second, we'll get to the Docker part, which is interesting. This is a full realm for testing Keycloak. So you can just load it up and you have all the users that you specified. They're all set up. Actually creates some demo users automatically with the roles that you specified. And then, as I mentioned Docker, it created also for you a Docker compose file. So you can just start it and everything is there ready for you. So once you download it, one of the pros that I've seen of this tool is that it actually works. I never had errors, but this is a demo. So I already downloaded a similar, a little more complicated example, and I will run that one. So we don't have to worry about downloading, compiling. The first time you compile something with NPM, it takes a little bit just because of NPM downloading stuff. But this is very similar to what I just showed you. So my one directory, I'll run Gradle W boot run. Oops. And that will run the Spring Boot application. And then for the front end, it's npm run dev server. And this will, oops, is it? No, did I do the wrong one? Oh yeah, no, it was running there. Okay, that's Spring Boot loading. Now let's load the front end for React. And it will automatically open a browser. And it didn't work. Okay. Wait, did I already have one? Okay. Of course, when you prepare the demo, I try this. Oh, okay, it was still actually initializing. That's why. Or maybe I have something in. Yeah, I must have already some other. Oh, I wonder if it's. Oops, no. No, I don't want the venture resolve. No, I'm running boot run. I wonder if I had something in here. Oh, yeah, it was already running here. Okay. Okay. Okay, it's running. The other window, let me do npm dev server. Oh, it's still starting. Let's leave it to start. Yeah, something running on the port. Wait, I'm in the right. All right, I don't know. Let's try one. Okay, let's try something else then. Let's try actually downloading the. I don't know why it's not working. Let's try a simpler one then. On 3000. Oh, I know what it's running. Yeah. Okay, I have my AI web UI running and oh, there you go. It's this one. Ah, yeah, it runs in 3000. Okay. And because I have it on auto start, usually I use a lot the web UI for the Olama, so it's okay. Good catch. All right, so let's start this one. boot run. And let's leave it. Start the backend first. Okay. Ah. Don't want command. Yeah, the setup was working, of course. Try again. Ah, there you go. So since I specified security, so this is Keycloak. Yeah, so you automatically got redirected there. The example IDs are here. So I'm just gonna copy, let's say, the admin. So these are all automatically generated by the tool if you don't specify a database. So and the password is always this one. There you go. So I have a React app. Also, let's see if I can see the Swagger. It automatically generated the Swagger open API definition. So if you're working with front-end guys or other people using the API, you have it all there documented. Yeah, and then you have a really simple CRUD implementation. So you can enter the data, group ID. And so this is all automatically generated. So yeah, pros is it generates good code. It works if you don't have other tools running on 3000. But my experience has been that, I mean, this React stuff was literally introduced yesterday, and from what I've seen, it works. Cons, it does not have, say, master detail for CRUD. So you would have to start coding it yourself. And I did try using AI and almost got there. But already having this with Spring Security, with Keycloak running, for somebody like me that has never done React before, having the full React code, you can let's see if I can show you that one. It's definitely a great learning starting point. So if you go under source and web app, this is the React application. So yeah, I mean, it did do a lot of code. So it's definitely a great learning tool for that, or just coding. And let's see. Any questions or anything?
How much did you say it costs?
Yeah, I think it's about $100 a year, or I think they have an option $39 for 3-4 months. But you can try. So first of all, if you go to the URL, I left one. You can share projects. So that project is shared right now. So if you go in, you have the paid version. The only thing, again, if somebody starts adding entities or changing things around, you will run into something. Oh yeah, and then some other nice features like oops, did I close that? Yeah, other nice features are integration with GitHub. So oops. Yeah, obviously you can download the code, but yeah, if you hit collaborate, it generates a URL that you can share. Or Git, you can have it automatically. Whenever there are dependency updates, it will automatically push to a branch that you want, that you specify, and so you can keep it up to date. Usually you will use this one to start a project and then leave it there. But it's pretty well documented. Explains all these integrations, how it works. Yeah, been a great experience so far, and yeah, no master detail current front ends. I'd say that's the biggest issue that I've seen for making it even more usable, but or useful. But again, just being able to do time leaf plus HTMX or Angular or React apps and do all the setup for you, I think it would save you at least a few days your work, if not more. And depending on how much you know these tools. So for example, for me, React, I would have had to learn React, and here I can already kind of hack a little bit, maybe with AI. Otherwise, it would have been a few months of learning React and TypeScript, which I've never done. So. Go ahead. Welcome.